this is the layer that we'll be really talking about. As we already know that 75% of the countries have already piloted at least one DPI layer. We've seen in a lot of our research and a lot of our studies that majority of the implementation so far has been in the data ID, the digital ID, and the digital payments layer. And there are some really interesting examples of sectoral DPI as well. But where we see the need for countries to really build momentum in a very strategic manner is the data exchange layer. And so that's what we'll be talking about right now. If we move on, I'll hand it back to Caro to talk a little bit about how ADB has been approaching DPI.
Thanks so much, Kunal. So just a few brief slides, and then we'll also talk about some work that the ADB has done in collaboration with Dalberg as well. So what you see on this slide here is the ADB Digital Transformation Framework. The Digital Sector Office within the Asian Development Bank is the newest sector. And so over the past year or so, we've been really thinking about what is our core strategic approach to digital transformation in Asia and the Pacific. And so what you see here that's represented in our house are the digital foundations that really underpin all of the various layers. So looking at digital and data infrastructure, digital policy and regulations, and digital safeguards. And those are core components of any of the investments that we're doing in terms of digital transformation. On top of those layers are digital accelerators. And this is, you can see very squarely, digital public infrastructure is a core component or business line that we focus on within the ADB. We also focus on digital skills and capabilities as part of those digital accelerators. And the top layer of the house are those use cases. So really building on top of the foundational elements, what do we see as in terms of the sectoral integrations of digital technologies across all of the work that the Asian Development Bank does as one of the core pillars for Strategy 2030 for the Asian Development Bank. So DPI is very squarely a part of the work that we're doing. Next slide, please. I also just wanted to mention the ADB DPI strategic approach that we're currently working on, in which a number of you in the audience and speaking in this workshop have contributed to. And so it's really been a collaborative effort to see how the ADB is going to approach DPI, thinking about not just those foundational elements that Kunal just described, but also the sectoral digital public infrastructure investments, apply DPI in terms of DPI across a number of different line ministries in the governments that we're working with, as well as next generation DPI, integration of artificial intelligence, AI-enabled DPI as an example. And on this slide here, you see the various instruments that we're using, the various components of the strategy, from the investment mechanisms that the ADB as the bread and butter of the ADB, as well as looking at those policy and institutional reforms. And we'll talk about some of those as part of this webinar as well. Knowledge and research, really thinking about how we can facilitate regional knowledge exchange and products around DPI. And also making sure that we're measuring the impact of the DPI investments and programs that we have. And finally, partnerships and collaboration. So through webinars like this one, as well as others, and we've developed a number of MOUs. One to note here is our tripartite MOU with co-develop in CDPI and working very closely with Dalberg, of course. And an example of that is our study that we co-produced that's actually out of the South Asia front office of the ADB. And really doing a deep dive into the 6 South Asian countries that include, and you can see at the bottom of the screen, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And so what the study really looked at was both the foundational elements of digital public infrastructure in the region, but also sectoral DPI. So, and what it found was, 5 out of 6 of the countries have digital identification, with Sri Lanka coming online very soon. The second element around digital payments. This is the most integrated across the 6 South Asian countries, so 6 out of 6 here. And the final one in terms of data exchange. And this is where we really saw the opportunity for building out more robust data exchange layers. And only India, is, 1 out of 6 have truly operationalized cross-sectoral data exchange. On the next slide, also just wanted to go a little bit deeper into what are some of those key opportunities for DPI. And so I would encourage everyone, and you can see the link that Arndt, who helped to author this study, has put in the chat. So please do check out the study. It goes into a lot more detail, both looking at these core DPI learnings. What are the trends that we're seeing? Seeing that payments is the strongest. Data exchange is the place where we need to see more growth and integration, as well as really focusing on those sectoral DPI. What are those hero use cases, those killer use cases for the integration of DPI so that it's just part and parcel of the day-to-day lives of the citizens in the countries that we're working with? And finally, at the bottom of the screen, you can see here the enabling environment. And so that's another layer that's explored as part of this study, and really making sure that there's that trust and governance resilience layer. And we'll hear about that a bit as well in our Cambodia example in a few minutes. So I'll stop there. I think I'm turning it over to Vineet from CDPI to do a bit more of a deep dive into data exchange. Vineet, over to you.
Thanks, Carol. Awesome. Excited to have everyone here. We'll do a quick intro for myself, but before we get there, probably a quick question. It'll be good to just get a read of the room. How would you rate sort of your own understanding of data exchange? You could be sort of on the extreme left-hand side of the spectrum saying, I'm hearing this for the very first time, or maybe someone who's a pro. So if you can just give us sort of log into sort of the Menti using your phone or the computer, whatever medium you're on, and if you can just jot in your responses, that'll be great. And then we can see where the average lies and potentially fine tune the session accordingly. We'll give everyone maybe 60 seconds or so. And as you do this, in case you also have any specific questions that you have top of mind for you, I'm assuming several of you on this room are actually practitioners who are either building data exchanges in different countries or different contexts, or are advising people who are building them. So if you have any questions that you have top of mind, do please drop them in the chat, and there's someone monitoring that so we can take them towards the end. Okay, I think we have like 40 odd people who have responded. I think the bulk, it's quite clear that a lot of people understand, I think, some of the foundational stuff already, and at least have heard of data exchange. But how do you actually unlock value of it, and what are some of the design choices is, I think, the crux of this. And that's pretty much what we are also going to cover in the session. So I'm glad we are already aligned, but in case there are further questions, I'm happy to go deep down in any of them. As we move along, just a quick intro first for Center for Deep Digital Public Infrastructure. On the next slide, you will see that CDPI was set up about 3 years ago to solve for tech capacity challenges in countries who want to build DPI. So we are an academic nonprofit. We do pro bono DPI technical architecture advisory, and we are software neutral and we are vendor neutral. That means that we're not advocating for any one particular technology solution or a vendor or even a standard. Often we help countries evaluate whatever works best for them and apply them in their context. So that's a little bit about CDPI, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the center. The way we look at data sharing, and stepping back a little bit from the data exchange conversation, we look at this from sort of this lens. So when people say, and this is important before we get there because it determines the kind of solution you want to build. So typically when people think of data sharing, they're talking either of these three things. So either there's personal data and non-personal data, right? So we need sort of ID data or land record or housing or insurance, all of that sort of falls in the personal data category. But non-personal data is like weather, soil, and all of that. That cannot be tied to Vineet, for instance, as an individual in a country. So those two sort of are the first sort of bifurcation. Within sort of personal data, there is sort of user controlled async data, which is essentially verifiable credentials and documents. So think of your own sort of birth certificate or your graduation certificate, right? Those are all things that can become credentials and sit with you, right? So Vineet takes its own sort of employment certificate or education certificate to go to a bank to get a credit card, for example. That's sort of credentials. Then there's real-time data sharing, which is essentially different government departments or businesses, for instance, who hold data on Vineet, sharing that data system to system, typically through APIs. That's sort of the crux of the session today, and that's what we are going to focus on. And then last one is anonymized aggregated data sets. So typically think of these as open data portals, and you can do a lot more essentially within that. But that's sort of the layer that we are going to talk through. On the next slide, you will see that let's actually now step into that sort of system to system data sharing, right? So on the one side, you have citizens, ministries, businesses, essentially that request a certain data, right? And on the other side, you have people who have actually give data, right? And essentially those actors are basically the same, right? So agriculture department, for instance, wanting data from social benefits wanting data from agriculture and vice versa, but it could also be businesses, right? So telcos can exchange data with ministries and so on. And keep clicking through. Let's just get the full visual on. So essentially, when you think of sort of the platform, like how do these sort of point-to-point data exchange systems actually work, right? Because in a country, if you have hundreds of governments and departments, right, not just at a federal level, but sub-national level, often at the city level, each of these departments can have their own systems. Each of their systems can be sort of built differently, and people requesting them would want maybe to slightly different things, right? So the data exchange layer tries to connect all of these sort of systems, all of these different information systems, as you can see. And typically, they are connected via some sort of an ID system. And I say typically because I think you can architect a system without that as well. But if you have a national ID system, that actually really helps and sort of allows for easier discovery of data. But again, it's not a roadblock. So think of this as sort of a North Star, but doesn't mean this is the only way to do it. And then underlying that are essentially what you call road rules and roles. Essentially, roads are essentially the architecture stack in some say, like the data pipes. Rules are who establishes it, like whether consent is included, what does privacy mean, and so on. And then roles are essentially, which is self-explanatory. So that's sort of the conceptual understanding of what sort of a data exchange looks like. But if you go to the next slide, you will see that in governments, the reality is actually messy. Right. CDPI has worked with maybe 60, 70 countries in the global south. At any given point, works with maybe 20, 25 countries, and we advised maybe about like 10 countries on data exchange systems. And some of them are actually in the room as well. So you would see that there are sort of several ministries on either side of that spectrum, and data gets exchanged through all mediums. So countries can have an X-road style system. They could have sort of their own instance or something more simple. Maybe they have APIs like to exchange data between one department to another. They've made that sort of themselves. In many cases, data is just shared on email, right? Like where people are like, oh, please, can you give this data to me? And then someone just sends sort of a monthly email to actually share that back, right? Sometimes you set up like an FTP server and so on as well, with things a little bit more complicated. Maybe someone's built an API gateway, right? So all of this sort of messiness exists in a country, right? And the goal, the one thing that if I can sort of nudge you to take away from this is the goal is to not replace this messiness with one system. If you go to the next slide, you will see that DPIs by design are meant to be inherently decentralized. So every department, every ministry can sort of have their own data. It is okay for these to be managed by many systems and many governments, right? They can evolve in different ways, right? And the key is that they need to work together, right? So think of these as different pieces, but with interoperability specifications, with interoperability protocols, like they can come together and sort of make a functioning whole, right? That's important, right? So I'll give you an example. We were working with a sub-national government in Latin America, where They were thinking of how to actually do social benefit transfers. And that subnational government has to fetch data from 26 different departments at the national level. Now, they already have sort of a centralized sort of data exchange layer that's modeled on X-Roads, but several departments that don't have the capacity are probably not sitting on them. They also have an API gateway that works. They also get data by email. They also get data by batches and so on. That's how sort of the messy reality is of all countries. And that's not a bad thing, right? But the thing that we typically say is like, if you go to the next slide, you have to invest in designing the right technical architecture. Like as people who are practitioners or maybe who are advising countries on what this looks like, you have to look at what the end game is, like what the use case is, and then work backwards from there to see how do these ministries actually talk to each other. So this is sort of a reference example that we did again with the country that we work with. You will see that you can see an X-Road interoperability in the right-hand side of one of the layer, which is sort of a small box in many things that need to happen to get the social benefits registry sort of live, right? This is for a social benefits transfer architecture that we did. So essentially what I'm again saying is that X-Roads interoperability works really well, but it could also be just a point-to-point API. It could also be an API gateway, depending on what is it that the country actually needs, right? So remember the sort of the messy on the previous slide where like different things sort of mess up. That is okay. You don't need a wholesale, hey, let's kill all these systems. Let's get a brand new flashy system to work. That's a good approach if you have like a lot of top-down alignment within the government and you can actually get government departments on board. But for any large country, I would say maybe more than 5 million, 10 million population, you will have multiple systems that exist in the country. And that's the big thing that I want you to take away. And that is okay, right? Now, the other last thing that I would say before I pass it back to Kunal and Dimi on the next slide is that sometimes getting data exchange systems off the ground is actually really hard because you require a lot of coordination. You need to evaluate many different sort of solutions. Even when the solutions are there, you need to build capacity, not just in the central node, say a Ministry of Digital Transformation or some other sort of IT agency, but also in individual departments and so on. So it's really hard, takes a lot of time. So what ends up happening in our view is that there's a little bit of slow down in momentum, right? Because it feels so enormous, this task, that you can't even get started. But the reality is that if you break data exchange down, there are two parts to it, right? You need to have a data funnel. So somewhere there's basically a clean, think of it as a clean Excel sheet that sits, right? You can further think of it as sort of a registry, right? That registry needs to have a certain schema, that needs to have a certain standard. Then you need to have an API that's sort of an endpoint. That bit is required for any data exchange system you want to build in the world. And there is no stopping you from doing that right now, even while you are actually evaluating what data exchange system to go with. So push for data sharing APIs, right? What are sort of API standards? Can you have open API sort of policies in the government? So any data that sits within a government entity needs to be published via an API. Right? That's sort of an easy win that you can do right now. Secondly, you can have sector data schema, right? An address saved by Ministry of Agriculture versus an address saved by Ministry of Health versus the Ministry of Child, Women and Child needs to all have similar fields, right? A name needs to be Vineet Bhandari, right? A first name and a middle name, but names can be more complicated this, right? So can you have a schema that works across the country, right? So when these systems actually talk to each other, that messiness has still to be resolved, right? So you can have a fancy system, but if a schema for a name in one system does not talk to another, then you'll never be able to match them, right? And you can say, hey, if I had national ID, then matching would be easier. Of course, yes, but that's another whole different conversation, right? As you can see, not many countries have sort of functional national ID systems at scale, right? In the Asia study that you saw. The last bit that I will say is a consent standard. And maybe if you can just flip a couple of slides. This, I think, is an important one. The next one is that any personal data that has to be shared needs to be consented to by the individual. And more countries are thinking of data protection laws if those don't exist today. And more often than not, there is already some thought around consent. There's already some thought around who is actually saving the data, what is the purpose of that, and so on. One important building block that can be done in parallel is to just have a simple approach to say, this is the consent artifact. So anyone sharing Vineet's data with, say, Carolyn, will need Vineet's permission as per this consent. Now, whether that's agriculture, whether that's health, and so on and so forth, and that consent artifact needs to say, Vineet's this data is going to Carolyn for these many days for this purpose, and so on and so forth, right? And no matter what the data exchange is, whether it's an API gateway, whether it's X-Road, it's a point-to-point connection, that consent artifact needs to exist within that, right? So it's a separate sort of almost building block that can work. The last thing I would say is that typically when people think of data exchanges on the next page, people think of government to government data exchange. They say, hey, I want to deliver subsidy, so I need to get data from health, from agriculture, and so on and so forth. I need to figure out housing, so can you give me data from cities and local municipalities, and so on and so forth, right? But what makes something DPI? It will be digital public infrastructure if it is reused by others. And when I say others, it includes governments, but it also includes markets. So no matter what system you use, you have to open up the rails for the private sector use. You can do so gradually, but that's where the magic happens, right? You will start to see second order, third order benefits, innovation starting to come up, which will probably not happen unless you actually open up those APIs and access to the private sector. So I will stop there. Again, just reminding messiness is okay, but think of how to connect that messiness and make it interoperable. And to do so, you can do a good technical architecture design, and that solves for a lot of purpose. And don't wait. You can start now. There are easy things that you can do to start now as you continue to evaluate what data exchange systems you need. And I think the sections follow will get into deeper on how do you actually pick a data exchange system. Back to you, Kunal.
Thanks so much, Vineet. On that very optimistic note, we'll move on. So there are, I think Vineet has really nicely framed, the data exchange, what a data exchange is, and the foundations of a data exchange. We now want to cover two more things. One is, very quickly just getting everybody on the same page in terms of what can data exchanges actually unlock for a country in terms of impact. A lot of you will already be familiar about this because you're practitioners, you're already going ahead. But then we'll get into for a policymaker, what are the different choices of implementing a data exchange? What are the different questions that you need to be asking when you decide to implement a data exchange? And what are the things that you need to actually solve for? And this is based on really the work that Dalberg has been doing with countries in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa. And we've just brought together all those learnings over here. And there'll be enough time for people to sort of engage in Q&A because we realize that this is a lot of presentation. So we'll keep enough time for Q&A as well. The status quo in a lot of countries right now is that data sits in silos, creating a lot of inefficiencies. Citizens have to resubmit their data across multiple portals, across multiple touch points within governments. They have to submit the same data again and again. In-person access to service delivery points is required, but it's restricted for a lot of rural and underserved communities. And there is a greater risk of data theft and leakage as there are multiple points of vulnerability, right? So that's basically how data is saved, is provided, to citizens across many governments. Now, what a data exchange system can actually allow is for data sharing to become streamlined and really cut the time for service delivery and really improve the efficiencies and bring down costs. There are enough examples of data exchange systems bringing down the time and the cost. It also eliminates the need for repetitive submission of data. A citizen now just has to submit their data. A citizen or a business needs to submit their data only once in a scenario where the data exchange is mature. Digital access along with aided physical service points actually lead to more inclusivity. And audit trails and consent layers can make data transaction very traceable and accountability can be increased, right? So this is really what we're trying to solve for and what we're trying to achieve. Here are some examples. CamDX, I'm not going to talk about because we'll actually have somebody from CamDX talk about the impact that they've seen. But you have MyInfo SyncPass in Singapore, where we've seen an 80% reduction, average reduction across application timelines for various services. More than 97% of the citizens are actually leveraging this for 2,000 plus public and private services online. X-Road in Estonia, which is known as the sort of benchmark, where you have 100% of state services that are being delivered online through X-Road, through the exchange. And apparently through their own assessment, 1,000 plus work years have been saved annually in Estonia through the X-Road platform. So this is the potential for impact. But now let's look into what are the different types of archetypes of data exchanges. And these are three that we wanted to highlight over here. We'll go one by one. And just to say that, these are archetypes that we've been able to find through our research. There might be more. The first one that countries have used quite often is the centrally managed federated exchange system, where you have MDAs, which are your ministries, departments, and agencies, and private organizations sharing data directly with other MDAs and private organizations. And then you have a central server that really governs the platform, but doesn't really participate in the data exchange. So what you're really saying is that the government is playing a really important role over here in terms of governing the central server and providing the standards around which data should be shared. But the data sharing is happening peer-to-peer between organizations, one organization to another organization. There is a strong accountability in this case for different departments to be ready to share data. So that's one sort of model of data exchange. The other model of data exchange is a more centrally API gateway model, which is the centrally facilitated exchange. Now, in this model, you have a central API gateway in the middle. And the purpose that the API gateway is serving is that it actually holds the catalogs and the routes for every kind of data that needs to be shared. So imagine a department A requires data from department B. The request will go through a central API gateway, which has a catalog of which department has what type of data and where the request needs to be directed. So this is a slightly more controlled form of data exchange. All the requests get authenticated centrally. This can be set up quite rapidly, but could get more complex as the scale increases because there is a centrally managed API gateway. The third model is the consent manager model, which is also known as the distributed federated exchange model. Now, in this case, the consent managers are regulated by the government, and these are typically private entities that route the data requests from the data provider to the data seeker. So essentially, these consent managers could be consent managers by these independent entities that are regulated entities. It could be they could be by different sectors, and every request that goes from one department to the other first has to go through the consent manager the entity that basically serves as a decentralized conduit for managing consent from citizens. Every request that goes to the consent manager will get the request from the consent from the citizen and then pass the data along. So that's the third model, where the consent manager is generating consent archetypes. Now we've seen all these models actually being deployed across countries. The centrally managed federated exchange is the X-Road model. The Estonia, that's what's been deployed in Estonia. Cambodia is deploying the sort of similar model across use cases such as business registration, KYC, and a consolidated citizen portal. The centrally facilitated exchange model is being deployed in Uganda, in Malaysia, across a number of different use cases. And India has sort of taken the lead by launching the data empowerment and protection architecture, the DEPA framework, that is the distributed federated exchange that has been used in use cases such as social protection, MSME lending, financial inclusion through the account aggregator framework. And it's gradually expanding into other use cases. The ag stack and the health already exists. So lots of different examples. Now the question is that how should a country decide which sort of model best suits them? And we came up with 7 parameters that these are more questions that a country needs to really ask themselves before deciding on which model, right? Number one, who owns and operates the platform? Is there going to be a central sort of ownership of the platform, or is it going to be a decentralized sort of a model? Where is data managed and where does exchange take place? Now, this is the question around governance, which is how much control does the government want around different policies, standards, governance? Who will participate in the data exchange? Like for example, in the first model that we spoke about, which has largely been used for G2G sort of data exchange, then has progressed into sort of businesses also exchanging data with governments and with citizens. That's the third question. Then there's the question about who will be responsible for ensuring security and trust. Should the metadata and data be visible to the intermediaries that are involved or not? That's a really important question, which determines which model best suits the country, how much data visibility exists. And then should the user the consent be implicit or explicit? This is a question of regulation, and a lot of countries have used different mechanisms, and some countries have a mix of implicit consent when it comes to government services, but the consent is required when it comes to private services. And will there be a user-facing app, and what purpose will that serve? So these are really some fundamental questions that are design choices that need to be asked before a country decides which model best suits them. Then if we move on, we'll get into sort of some of the foundational steps for implementing a data exchange, and I'll hand over to Shashank to run us through a few slides.
Hey, thanks, Kunal. So before we get into actually the architecture and the design of a data exchange, we've experienced that there are some foundational elements that need to be in place before even the implementation journey begins, right? So which is what we are trying to also focus on in this session, is how do you bridge that gap between your plan, strategy, and then the implementation? So somewhere falls right in the middle over there. The 3 key pillars we see as part of this, the foundational elements that are required for smooth, secure data exchanges. One is the governance mechanisms, right? What are the institutions that are going to be involved as part of governance structures? What will be the roles and responsibilities that they will play, right? So because there are multiple models which are possible in some countries, we have observed that there is a structure where the PMO itself is kind of leading the data exchange efforts. It's a huge national priority and it's been taken up, right under the Prime Minister's office or the IT authority for that country. And like I think Vineet was suggesting, there are other kind of decentralized mechanisms where sectoral kind of DPIs are evolving, and those have taken up a more leading role over there. And so the institutional structures have evolved from there. But what is very clear is that without clear ownership, the data exchange will have no one to kind of sustain it in the long term, right? But if the intention is for it to eventually scale and support both public and private sector use cases in the country. So that is one fundamental element. The second is the legal and regulatory kind of foundations, like the laws and the regulations which need to support both data protection as well as data sharing. Whether data sharing is possible, in what scenarios, and in what scenarios it cannot, where consent should be taken, where consent is implicit. A clear direction needs to be provided over here, and there needs to be clear mandates which need to be set for institutions which have been identified in the governance mechanisms in the first step. And lastly, here's what we have learned throughout this journey is that technical perhaps forms only the third step if this were to be kind of like sequenced, right? It comes quite later, and people kind of touch upon architectures and technical standards right up front. But in fact, the governance and legal and regulatory form much more important parts is what we have realized in our experience. The technical also is important, and here is where digitization of in many countries records are present in a mix of physical and digital forms, and so that digitization journey and then subsequently with the standardization journey and as mentioned APIs being able to exchange, all of that then follows suit and almost can be done parallelly before even like setting up the data exchange architecture. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, if we were to just double click on these three pieces, as I shared, like many countries have done this in different ways, but if we were to see the different kinds of bodies who have been involved in this, in the governance, overall governance of a data exchange platform, we see one, if this were to be seen at national scale, we see one owning an implementation body. This could be, like I said, it could be driven right from the Prime Minister's office, it could be an IT authority, or it could be a completely separate body which has been set up solely for the data exchange. And this body will be someone who will be kind of owning and setting up the platform, but at the same time also be responsible for maintaining it and will have the mandate to drive uptake from multiple other departments within the government and the private sector. So that kind of mandate lies with this body. The second is what we have seen is a almost a body which holds technical expertise, right? It could be the departments which are mandated for overseeing IT solutions in that country, or it could be a separate a technical assistance body. But this particular body oversees what existing systems are there, what are their state, and whether they are ready to participate in the data exchange architecture. The third and fourth are more sector-specific bodies, and because the use cases, as we discussed and will also be part of the subsequent session, is the data exchange eventually scales from use case to use case. Now, each use case can be specific to a sector, and these sectors would have some anchor agencies, and by anchor agencies we mean like those organizations or those departments within the government which are slightly ahead in their digital journey. They've already experienced some API-based transactions, they have done some exchanges, and they serve as examples for others. And so they are early kind of front runners in terms of joining and participating in a data exchange platform, and then they serve as a kind of reference points within their sector. The other body within the sector that we see is a regulating body, like an oversight body, which is within the sector, sets the rules and is mandating all departments and private sector organizations to participate and then adhere to certain standards. And the last two are more overarching and like enabling kind of bodies. One is the Digital ID Issuing Authority, the body which has kind of, since we said DPI for identity, that layer has kind of been set up in many countries already. It'll be crucial to integrate that digital ID into each participating organization's databases, as well as a fundamental kind of interlinking field for the data exchange to happen. So it will be the common field that will reference one citizen across different databases, and that field is the digital ID. And lastly is a national skilling body, an institution or agency. It varies in different countries, but in terms of setting up capacity for the long term to be able to own and operate this data exchange in case it scales to a national scale, to be able to run it sustainably, there needs to be a clear buildup of skills and overall know-how of the data exchange and what it can help you achieve. That needs to be clear for the operators and of the platform, but also the participating organizations and departments, because for them to gain the most value out of the system, they will have to first understand what value they would like to unlock from it. If you move to the next slide. Yeah. As I've already mentioned, like in the legal and regulatory standpoint, two key things stand out. One is the laws and regulations which govern data protection, right? In terms of first laying out citizens' data rights, what exactly is covered there, and what can and cannot be shared as part of like data exchange, right? It is also important to lay out clear mechanisms for grievance redressal and for citizens to raise concerns in case they feel that personal data is being shared without their consent. So this also covers the point Kunal mentioned earlier about data visibility and user interaction. So if they are able to have an interface where they are able to track where their data has been used or which agencies have used their data over a period of time, there needs to be a mechanism for them to raise any concerns which they observe from there. And what we've also seen is that, mechanisms for penalties and almost like to discourage misuse of data through the data exchange is very crucial in terms of setting those principles right up front. In terms of data sharing, like I mentioned, the mandate for data sharing has to be there in the first place because there's a lot of hesitation from multiple departments as well as private sector organizations in terms of who they can and cannot share data with. I think the default response that agencies have is that we won't share data. And so that mandate needs to be in place with the right security kind of protocols so that data can be protected, but at the same time, data sharing is enabled. If we can move to the next slide. Yeah, and lastly comes the technical piece. If we can just show all the three parts of this together. So we see this as part of three steps, right? So one is, like I said, digitization itself is a journey, and like many countries or many kind of organizations are still in the journey of moving from physical records to digital records. So that itself is a journey, and like Vineet was saying, we would not need to wait for a data exchange decision to be made for this journey. This journey can start now itself. So digitization needs to start, and we have seen that this is a longer term effort. Two is, once that digitization is done, data has to be standardized. It has to be registries need to be set up, and there needs to be mechanisms for databases to communicate with one another. There need to be fields which can be cross-referenced. A citizen in one database, if you have to reference the same citizen in another database, those fields have to be set up, and so there have to be standardization, deduplication, and transliteration, which have to be part of this process. And lastly, as I mentioned, a common unique identifier is needed, and in most cases or many cases, that is the digital ID for that country, which serves as this common identifier. We have a question, and in terms of all of the foundational steps that we just covered, what do you feel would be the topmost challenge in setting up, in case you are thinking about a data exchange? Of all the three foundational elements we have covered, what would be the topmost challenge that you foresee? I guess we've gotten some responses. Mostly seems to be a larger share of the legal and regulatory foundations, which is what we've observed as well. And it's kind of like good to see that that validates. And secondly, followed by the governance mechanisms. All right, I will pass it back to Caro then to take us through the next part.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Shashank, and everyone. The past few slides, I know that we've really been focused on presentations, but it's been really eye-opening for me as well. I'm really exciting to see these archetypes and these key decisions that need to be made. Please continue to put any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end, of course, to address those. I'm really excited for our next speaker as well. So I'll do a little bit of transition here. The Asian Development Bank is working very closely with the Techo Startup Center in Cambodia, have been for a number of years, but we're embarking on a journey together to support the National Data Exchange, or CAMDX. And so joining us from Techo Startup Center, or TSC, is Meng Thong Song, who is the Director of Technology and Innovation at Techo Startup Center, and he'll be walking us through the Cambodia journey in terms of national data exchange, really looking at a great case study, a great example of how some of these decisions that we've been discussing were made in country and what the next steps are. And really excited that it's in collaboration with the Asian Development Bank, with the ADB, looking at the modernization and scale and use cases to really unlock that combinatorial value for data exchange in the country. So Meng Thong, I'll turn it over to you for the next few slides. Thanks.
Thank Caroline. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank to ADB, CDPI, and Dalberg for having us today from the George Startup Center. I'm Meng Thong, the technical lead from the Cambodia data exchange operator. Well, since earlier, we have our colleague Vineet, Kunal, and Shashank. They walked us through a lot of things, the concept of data exchange system, DPI, its benefit, archetype, and foundational step for them. So I'll just focus more directly to our Cambodia's practical experience, why we started CamDX and how it evolved, what it enabled us today, and why it's important right now for us to modernize it to the next level and so on. So back in the day, CamDX did not begin just as a pure technology project. It began as a government reform effort to solve a real services delivery problem. Some people may ask, how could they start building the platform and so on, but they need to at least understand where they need to start. So let's see our experience here. So back in 2019, our senior officials from the Ministry of Economy and Finance wanted to simplify business registration in Cambodia. At that time, an applicant had to interact with multiple platforms in various institutions or agencies, which include the Ministry of Commerce, General Department of Taxation for tax registration, and the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training for enterprise declaration and so on. So each institution already had their own system and process, but those systems did not interoperate very well with one another. So as a result, the applicants still had to make multiple visits, submit similar document, or sometimes duplication of information to those different agencies. So the challenge was not only about digitalization, the challenge was the interoperability. So how could the government system work together so that the business could experience one simplified service instead of several disconnected processes? So that was the starting point of CamDX. So next slide, please. Well, when Cambodia studied, the e-Estonia and X-Road experience, one important lesson was clear that at the time, we did not need to build one big centralized database to solve our problem. Instead, we needed a trusted data exchange layer where each institution, government agency could, keep their ownership of the data while also being able to exchange those data securely with other institutions. So this federated model from the X-Road was suitable for Cambodia at the time and now and so on. So because ministry and agency remain responsible for their own system and data, and CamDX does not take ownership of those information or data. It provides just the trust layer, the security mechanism, the governance structure, that allow them to exchange those data securely. So this was important because it minimized disruption. Existing system could, connect through APIs and security servers instead of just being replaced by one big government system, so on. So the decision was not to build another silo. The decision was to solve interoperability between those systems. Next slide, please. Well, so MDX was built around a few simple but important principles. Our colleague here, some of them already mentioned. We first focus on connecting those fragmented system into a working ecosystem. So it allows us, especially the government system, to work independently, but still interact with one another. And secondly, KMDX does not own the data of each member. So it's very important principle that for building trust when you want to onboard each ministry or government agency, it's very sensitive, And the third part is that CAMDX support secure data exchange. The information being shared with each institution or exchange between them must be trusted, controlled, and auditable. So, and the fourth thing is CAMDX provide, give them the owner full control of their API access control. So we provide them how to control it, the manual, the security standard, the documentation, and walk them through anything, but they have to control it themselves. So they have full control of what they are having or opening to other agency, the access and so on. So this principle also support the once only principle where legally or operationally possible, data should only be collected once and shared among the relevant institutions instead of asking the citizen or business owner to repeatedly submit the information the same again and again. So our approach was also, the land and expand. So we have to start somewhere, right? So we start with one essential use case for business registration, prove its value, and then gradually expand the ecosystem. The next slide, please. So X-Road provides us with the core technology for secure federated data exchange, but a functioning national data exchange ecosystem requires more than just the software. So Cambodia also need the trust services. We need to have the public key infrastructure for certificate, digital certificate, signing, authentication, and verification mechanism. And these are important because members need to trust the identity of the other system in the ecosystem. So, and that's not come with the X-Road. We also need to, digitally authenticate, or we need the consent mechanism. We heard our colleague mention earlier about user consent. So we really need that. So we need to build, we had built the CAMDG key, which plays very important role in identifying user in the digital space in Cambodia right now, and supporting the consent-based flow here, where user involvement for consent data sharing for between ministry and so on. So in addition, the legal and institutional environment is critical. Technology can, enable exchange of information, but the laws, rule, and institutional coordination help build those confidence for adoption. So this is why we normally say technology enable exchange, but trust enable adoption. So CAMDX became not only a technical platform, but a part of a broader digital government ecosystem. So if you move to the next slide, we have what we have here today, the whole ecosystem of CAMDX right now. As of today, we have expanded from its first use case to a broader ecosystem of various API and digital services. And on the left side here, we have the API services for eKYC. The banking private sector is using them. The eKYB, the OZR API for ID card and passport, the driving license verification API, and so on, and more to come there. So this API allow institution to work just become the CamDX member and connect and request to the API provider and grant them access with some form of agreement and MOU and so on, so that they could verify those information. And then on the right side here, we have services side. CamDX support the platforms such as the ecosystem for e-biz services for business, the global travel assessment system, the informal economy, Khmer agriculture suite, and more. So the important message here is that CamDX is no longer only a project for business registration. It has become a national data exchange layer that connects ministry, agency, and the digital public services and private sector participants. So this is also why governance and operations become more important. As more services depend on CamDX, the platform must be reliable, secure, scalable, and well managed. So to the next slide, we have some statistics like the growth of CamDX usage. So as of the end of April this year, we have 55 members from private sector and 32 from the public. And then the platform has processed around 116 million total transaction as of that, and with an average around 1.4 per month. And the transaction growth show that CamDX is no longer only a pilot or concept. It's already being used in the real government and private sector services. But it's also bringing out us the new responsibility, like as a higher adoption mean higher expectation for availability, security, monitoring, service management, and operational maturity. So in the early stage, the key question was, can data exchange really work in Cambodia? But today the question is different. How do we scale it securely, reliably, and sustainably? The next slide, please. So this brings us to the next chapter of CamDX modernization. Well, of course, with support from ADB, the coming bridge project, hopefully. The first chapter of CamDX was about building and proving the platform. And the second chapter then was about adoption, ecosystem expansion, and still going on. And now we are moving a little bit more to the modernization of CamDX and hopefully institutionalize it. So there are several priority areas that we need to focus here. I'd say first, we are going to have the API catalog and metadata standard. As the number of APIs grow, services need to be, easier to discover, to govern, to reuse and manage. And secondly, the member security baseline. Since CamDX depend on many connected members, the security of overall ecosystem also depend on the readiness and security posture of each participant. And third, we have the infrastructure and resilience. So as CamDX become more critical, we need to strengthen our capacity, redundancy, disaster recovery, monitoring, and operational continuity. And fourth, operator capability. TSC as the CamDX operator need to, to have a stronger procedures, tools, reporting mechanisms, and knowledge transfer so that the platform can be operated sustainably at national scale. So the first chapter proved that secure data exchange can work in Cambodia. So the next chapter is about scaling it with stronger standards, resilience, security, and trust. So to conclude here, Cambodia's CamDX journey started from a very practical problem. We simply want to simplify business registration. But solving the problem requires more than just digitizing one service. It requires interoperability, trust, legal support, digital identity, of course, consent, and an operator model. So today, CamDX is part of Cambodia digital public infrastructure. It supports APIs, services across government agency, private sector use cases. And going forward with ADB bridge support, our focus will be to modernize CamDX so that it can better support Cambodia's wider digital government agenda in a secure, scalable, and sustainable way. Thank you.
Hi, as we get into the Q&A, I think given our colleague from Cambodia just presented quite impressive work there. I think we can start with questions on that because I see some of those flowing in the chat. Please do keep putting in the questions in the chat. I think some of our team has also started responding. But I think to our colleague from Cambodia, the first question would be in terms of, can you clarify the ownership of CAMDX? There's an assumption that TCF is the operator and not the owner. So that's a question, but also along with that, some question on the usage of CAMDX reduced in 2025 and 26. Is that the case? Any insights on why that happened?
Okay, thank you, Savesh. Well, so the first question is about the ownership of the platform, right?
Yes.
So why TSC is the operator and not the owner? So our current, I would say, to my best knowledge here, the platform is owned by the government, and TSC was appointed as the operator of the platform, and that's it. So we are not the owner of the system, but our team is the current operator of the platform. And the next question is about, you mentioned about the drop of the usage.
Yeah. Are there any insights on why that happened? Or is there more to that graph?
Well, I would say that I noticed the drop on from 24 and 2025. There was a shift over there in 25. There was an even of there's a use case where government API it's been free for a long period of time, the eKYC API, and then there was a interministerial practice. There is a fee charge for those APIs, so that's what explain the drop of the usage. Yeah, because most of the transaction here from from private sector, they're using the eKYC verification API, and then there's a fee charge, so somehow they need to manage and not at the free level, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good insight also on the usage pieces. I think there's also a question, if I can pass this to maybe Vineet. How are we seeing the sequencing of priorities and interventions play out across countries with low, medium, and high capacity institutions? This is a colleague from UNDP who's asked this.
Great question. I think, especially for countries where there's a lot of high capacity, I would say starting top down on a centralized sort of model that can mandate individual ministries to also come on board works quite well. So that top down push is quite useful. I would say in places where there's relatively low capacity, starting with the use case and solving for that a lot more. So as you've seen in the Cambodia example, the very first slide was not about data exchange, right? The very first slide was a citizen saying, I need to set up a business, and currently it takes a lot of time, right? And the beauty of what Cambodia has done is that in doing so, they set up the rails to create a data exchange platform. And that, I think, is the single biggest takeaway that you should definitely take home, that even for a low capacity country, you can still start from a powerful use case. And even if you do not put up sort of an as sophisticated a platform as CAMDX, a more simpler API-based sharing mechanism that can start with certain standard schemas for data sharing can also work quite well. So I would say there's sort of several different sort of starting points. And secondly, I would also urge you to sort of think of countries as not in those three categories. Even in high capacity countries, there are departments that are very low capacity. right? And so sometimes they need sort of just simpler API modules. And even countries where there's very low capacity traditionally can have one or two people who are very high capacity and want to actually drive it, right? So always sort of the thing that we take is like the menu is quite wide, right? From just simple API point-to-point integration to like sophisticated CAMDX-like systems, and just let's work with the country and the use case and what does that use case require, but not just solve for that use case. Like just don't create a system only for business registration, right? Just don't create a single portal for business registration. That's the wrong sort of way to do. That's not the DPI way of doing it. The DPI way of doing it is to ensure that what you build can today solve for business registration, but tomorrow can solve for agri-land data sharing, for instance, if need be.
I just wanted to mention there that in the next part of the webinar, we will be covering exactly what Vineet has mentioned. How do you think about identifying use cases? Where to begin is the really important question, right? And we'll be discussing a framework that can be potentially used by different countries.
Couple of questions more on CAMDX. I think we'll take one more on the CAMDX, which is what's the legal architecture underlying the data sharing? I think even when we were discussing the three pieces of governance that Shashank was presenting, the legal piece was something that was on top of mind for folks. So would be great to address that question. What is the legal architecture underlying the data sharing for CAMDX? If I can invite Mengtong to respond.
Well, thank you, Savish. I'd say technology, team, operation, they are pretty cool, but to build trust, we need those legal and framework to back behind. So the legal architecture here in Cambodia, when we start the platform, we operate, we piloted, the government need to back it. So we have the sub-degree mentioning about what is the scope of data exchange for public services to build trust on, I mean, when we need to onboard on all those agencies, they will ask us, why data exchange via CAMDX? Is there any law regulation behind it to protect their information and so on? So most of those information are highlighted on the sub-degree level, and it will mention the roles of the operator, what are their role, the members, what they need to do. Is there any security baseline? Is there any penalty or scope and responsibility and so on? So that's the ones for the data exchange. There will be there's been more like the CAMDG key for authentication, and therefore the legal framework for business registration, for and more on the for digital signature, and more to come, just like that. So in order to achieve our current progress here, we have a lot of support from the government in the form of those legal architecture. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that response. I think there was quite a bit of interest on the three different types of the systems that we presented. There was a request from someone to share the slides, which we will see if we can paste in the chat. I'm not sure if we have the permission to do so. But there was a question around quite the beginning of the presentation, is that interest in seeing and understanding the three different consent layers management. If I will read out the question, better understanding how the consent management layers typically work across the three different archetypes, or the three architecture types. If I can invite Shashank to address that.
Yeah, thanks, Arish. So in the first model, which was the centrally managed and federated exchange, right, where the central server doesn't really participate in the exchange itself. Exchange is P2P. Typically, what we have seen is that the consent has been implicit, which is it has been it has been implemented for use cases where consent has already been sought or already data has been housed within particular government departments and agencies and can be shared for those use cases with other departments in the government. So mostly for G2G kind of transactions is where that model has kind of evolved from. As of today, that model allows for building a consent extension on top, which is like it allows for building a consent layer, which can also seek explicit consent from citizens, where personally identifiable information is involved. In the second model, which is the API gateway, again, that is also a model which supports both implicit as well as explicit consent mechanisms. It is, for example, like it is right now present in Singapore as the Apex gateway model, and over there, SingPass and I think there is an app that Singapore has, which specifically is used for seeking and receiving consent from citizens. So even that model allows you to build a consent layer and integrate it along with the data exchange. The third model which we have is the distributed exchange, which we had shown, the distributed federated exchange. That actually, the basis of it, since it's a highly decentralized model, there are multiple intermediaries that are involved. That the basis of that model itself is consent based. It has been implemented in India as an example of the DIPA framework, right, which Kunal was talking about. Their consent is part of every transaction. The consent artifact, which was mentioned in this session as well, is part of every transaction and is a critical part of that entire architecture. So that is how the consent layers vary amongst the three. Each of the three architectures have evolved over time to allow for both implicit and explicit consent. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for the response there, Shashank. I think we'll take a couple more questions. I see some of them more trickling into the chat, so please do keep bringing them in. I guess I can ask Vineet to come in on this. Is how does a bottom-up DPI governance look like, particularly in low and middle income countries? I think the technical cannot come first approach has been appreciated. So would be great to get a quick response from you on that, Vineet. And I see some hands up. If I can please request you to put the question in the chat. We have quite a few people on the line. We won't be able to, unfortunately, take folks to comment directly on questions. Vineet?
I think the policy bit is actually really important. The way we advise countries, and again, just to be first caveat, I think we are technology advisors. We don't primarily advise on policy. So I think the recommendation that we typically give to countries is that you should right-size governance and policy. So it's not that right now in countries, data is actually not being shared between departments and so on. Like people are already sharing data, right? And often that data is shared by the citizen in many ways, right? So a citizen takes sort of a certificate from one and sort of gives it to another form that says I'm eligible for this to another department and so on. And sometimes it's just very informal in that sense. So what we typically recommend is that depending on the use case, you should have the right enabling sort of rules and laws in place to make that happen. When you're sort of overhauling the entire data exchange sort of system and like setting up something like a CAMDX, obviously, exactly like our colleague from the country mentioned, you do need a more foundational sort of governance or policy law in place. I hope that partially at least answers your question.
I can add there. I mean, thanks for asking that question. It's super relevant to the kind of countries that we're talking about where data exchange can really add a lot of value. So there's obviously that bottom up, that top-down governance layer that we spoke about, right? Defining laws around privacy, around consent, around data sharing, around integrating ID with the data exchange systems. We spoke about that, and those systems need to be, and those laws need to be defined very clearly for data exchange to work. But then there is the sort of bottom-up governance layer also, which is at the level of citizens receiving services, in villages, registering businesses in local provinces, for example, and that's where the role of governance is really important across different layers of DPI, right? Across different layers of DPI. So, for example, local governance is really important when data is being collected to develop data registries, right? So it's really important for the local authorities and the local bodies that are actually collecting the data to make sure that the data it includes everybody, right? One example of this is the ACT Act that has been implemented in India to make sure that if all of the citizen services are going to be deployed leveraging ACT Act, then we must make sure that all women farmers are included in the data registries of the ACT Act, right? So that's the responsibility of the local governance. The second is that if in some cases the systems are not able to provide citizens the right type of services or citizens are getting excluded, then there need to be proper local redressal systems in place as well, right? Where does a citizen go if they're not able to receive a service? That's just because everything has now been digitized. They were used to now earlier interacting with people in person. Now the system has been digitized, but because of some incorrect data, citizens might not be getting their services. So having important redressal systems. And lastly, I would say related to this point is to make sure that digitization is not 100%. There is enough provision for offline services as well, right? So the digital system is really important. So there are these are just three that I've mentioned that are top of mind. There are other ways also in which sort of bottom-up governance needs to be enabled to make sure that these DPI-enabled services are not exclusionary in nature. Hope that answers some of the question.
Thank you, Kunal. Thank you, Vineet. I think we'll do maybe one last question and then a closeout on what's to come next. Maybe Kunal, I'll pass this on to you again in terms of what are some specific explanation how interoperability that is enabled by a data exchange in the end support government to strengthen its single source of truth data repository. So I think it's a little bit to build on what could be some of that impact of data exchange on how even government starts to view some data repository and use the data repository.
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of obviously inefficiencies in the system when interoperability is not built in, right? In terms of how data is being shared. And we spoke a little bit about this, right? What ends up happening is that if a citizen or a business or requires any kind of service, then they have multiple touch points. They will have to provide their data many times over two different departments. One simple example that was presented by the Cambodia colleague here is that if there is a business registration that needs to be done by an entrepreneur, then the historical systems will require that person to go to a business registration department. Then they will probably need to go to another department to get some sort of a no objection certificate. Then they might need to go to income tax department to get some certificates from there, and the chain sort of continues. So what interoperability really enables over there is that as a citizen I can just apply for the business registration online, and each department then speaks to each other under obviously the right governance mechanisms, under the right standards, etc. And they can share data with each other so that a citizen doesn't have to go from one place to the other, and that leads to a lot of efficiencies, right? And I think the broader picture over here is that a lot of countries have digitized over the last 10, 15 years. A lot of low income, medium income countries have digitized over the last few years, but they've not thought through interoperability. So there's an opportunity now to start for countries that are still digitizing their government services, still digitizing their departments, are at a very early stage. They don't have these legacy challenges. There's an opportunity for them to build in interoperability from scratch. I think that's the point Vineet was also talking about. Like, let's just get started. And as you're getting started, don't solve for one service. Start with one service, one use case, but then put in place the interoperability mechanism so that it can then be scaled to multiple services. So that's an opportunity.
Thank you, Kunal. If we have another 5 minutes left, so just if we move to the next slide, the first mentee is back. we discussed what we knew from our own experiences about data exchange. We saw folks who had actually engaged a lot with the data exchange piece of the DPI, but want to understand it more. And they did not have the right language for design choices. Would love to get a quick sense back from the room in terms of where do we still sit? Is it still 3? Have we moved some of the folks to the 4? Have some of the folks from 1 and 2 move to 3 and 4? Would love to get a quick sense check on this. And then I will also preface what's to come on the next session. Just for folks who are on the line, if you just scan the QR code, it should come up directly on your screen and you can vote from one of the options. We give 15 more seconds. All right. Let me quickly, before we close out, we have a couple of minutes, preface what we're going to do in the next session. So we discussed a lot of the basics and the foundations of the data exchange system today. But there's more to this. So how do you, we talked about use cases, but how do you go about prioritizing a pilot use case? We talked a lot about the ministries and the departments that need to come together, that need to be involved. How do you start assessing readiness on the part of these participating ministries, departments, where the gaps are? And finally, how do you start to design the implementation roadmap for setting up a data exchange? And what does that entail? Based on our experience and the work that we've been doing, we will bring some content around this and we'll have similar discussion that we did today. And for those, please do join in our second session. If we go 2 slides ahead, the next slide, please. One final mentee, this is mostly a free text to say what you're taking away from this session. We'd love to hear some honest reflections. And also, if you're interested in joining the next session on the use case prioritization, we will send out the invite to the folks who were on this session. And would love to see you back and have a similar discussion next time around, which will not be too far away in a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. Kathleen will correct me if I'm wrong. I just love the first response.
Yeah, Vineet has said messiness is okay, so you can go with it.
If we can scroll up, would love to keep seeing the responses as well. Thank you. Or maybe we cannot scroll up. It's okay. I realize we're on time. So just quickly on the next page, if we can get a quick response from folks, and then we can close out the session. All right. We'll see responses trickling in, but I think we can stop sharing the screen now. Harsh, thank you so much. We will share out the invite for the next session with the whole group that was here today. We have the email IDs. We'll make sure that you get the invite for the next session.